welcome, Confidence to the ISC2 Cape Town chapter. Thank you for agreeing to do this for us. I don't take this for granted. Confidence is a global speaker. She's quite a busy person. And I thought it would be quite valuable, for the IC2 members to hear from a global speaker like yourself on this quite important topic, and I think often overlooked topic. I often think I've been to a number of conferences. API security doesn't make it onto the agenda often. It's always the same things: human firewall, SOC, operation center, the normal stuff, third-party risk management. So quite excited to unpack this with you. I don't really think you need an introduction, but I'm going to allow you to introduce yourself. And from your side, if there's anything to share slides, you can bring that up as well. In terms of format, what we'll do is Confidence will introduce herself. She's got some slides she's going to share and talk us through. It'll take about 25 to 30 minutes. And then the last 25 minutes, we will really leave for questions and answers to unpack anything specific around this topic that you want to delve a little bit deeper into. Okay, so over to you, Confidence.
Thank you so much, Grant. It's an absolute pleasure and delight to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the IC2 Cape Town chapter, and I hear freshly minted. So I'm very, very honored to be here. I can't yet share my slides, so maybe when you stop sharing, I'll be able to share that. But today I'll be speaking about common API security pitfalls. Okay, I don't have sharing rights. Let me see. I've lost that button that says share. Okay, I found it, sorry. I found it, yeah. Give me a second. Okay, found my presentation now. So while that's loading, I was saying that I'm going to be speaking about common API security pitfalls and bad practices. So just allowing us to zoom into what's really, really important and what we must pay attention to as we speak about API security or as we have APIs in our environment. And just speaking to what Grant said earlier, that API security is often overlooked. It's one of those things that you do later on when it's convenient, or not even do at all, or not do well enough. So it's a pleasure to be here and just discussing it. I'm having a bit of an issue with my slides, but I'm going to try one more time to project that. So not a problem, I think, is from my end. Just going to do replace. This time it should work. Okay, looks like it's loading up.
It's loading up.
Yeah, it looks like so. I can't see anything on my screen. It's just blank. Okay, so maybe what I'll do is close out the version of it here and just, technology always does this sometimes. Okay, nothing to worry about. We'll be there shortly. Let me see. Worst case scenario, I will just do this from my mind. Yeah. Okay, it's saying, you know what's going to happen? Let me just save a different version of it, because it's just saying it's not working up here. Done here. This should work. It's interesting how we were seeing the slides just a while ago, and and now it's like, what's happening here? But I've renamed it, and hopefully, yes, it's finally loading. Looks like so. Good. So we're here. So finally, we can then really get started with our presentation. So I'm speaking about common API security pitfalls and bad practices. So sort of like the bad guys you need to be very mindful of. And Grant gave me the pleasure of introducing myself. And if I was to say in a very short, not so short nutshell, it would be that I'm a two-time founder. So I'm a founder of CyberSafe Foundation, and then I also am the founder of Merkle Funds. I'm a multi-award winner, one of them being the Cybersecurity One of the World Awards that I won last year. I also really love to teach about API security, and true to myself as being a very relatable person and relatable in the way I, share my knowledge, I chose cooking metaphors as a way to describe API security best practices. And so I launched out what is called API Kitchen, that we basically use these metaphors to teach about API security best practices. So I definitely just encourage you to check out my channel on YouTube. I have so many episodes. I just finished a season just last week. So you should definitely check that out. You'll absolutely enjoy all of the episodes. I also speak across the world, and I am also very passionate about getting women into the cyber field. So I describe myself as a gender inclusion actionist, and very key emphasis on actionist because there's a lot of talk, and talk is cheap, but it's in the doing that we're going to be able to move the needle and get more women into cyber. And so I'm concerning myself with that. I'm also the author of a book that's coming out next quarter, which is API Security for White Hat Hackers. So it's currently available for pre-ordering on Amazon. You should definitely check it out. So we've been speaking about APIs before, like API security issues, or we've just said we're going to touch on that. What are the common pitfalls? But before we talk about the common pitfalls, we need to first and foremost understand what APIs are. I'm not assuming everyone here is very familiar with them, so I'm going to start off with that. So there are many complex conversations and many complex definitions of APIs, but this is maybe one of my signature ways of describing what APIs are. So if you walk into a very nice fancy restaurant, you don't know, what's going on in the back end. Possibly your very nice meal is being cooked over firewood or maybe on some fancy stove or gas. You don't know what's happening in the kitchen. You don't know if your chef is actually wearing a white hat or a black hat like this one with his white outerwear covering his body. You're not sure what's happening in the back end, but all you see is this nice fancy restaurant. You see a well-dressed waitress or waiter come up to you, take your order, go to the kitchen, and then your food is made exactly how you want it, maybe spicy or not, maybe with some extra cheese or not, and whatever extras you have put there, right? That order is placed using a waiter or using the services of a waiter. And that waiter goes to the kitchen, which in this context is the back end for us, and then fetches that information and serves it back to you at the fancy restaurant, which is the front end. Now, all of this happens in a normal setting, but in our digital landscape, or in the internet as we have it right now, considering that APIs make up over 80% of the traffic on the internet, I have chosen to then, describe APIs as the wait staff of the internet. They take your orders as you interact with apps, as you interact with web applications, as you interact with just about anything that has a front end or other interfaces. So that is what I'd like to describe APIs as. Because the entire ecosystem is really just connected by APIs, we are then able to integrate with other software systems. We're able to communicate with other APIs, other software systems that are very different from ours. We're able to send information, we're able to collect information from them without necessarily having our systems having to be the same way those other systems were built. That integration, that marriage that allows the ecosystem to function across the continent, across the world, across our industries and all of our partners are actually made possible by APIs. So I'd like to also describe APIs as a plumbing system of the internet. Imagine if your plumbing system, for example, was faulty. What would that look like? It would look like possibly your water pressure on your tap not coming up well. It will look like sometimes a broken pipe, and maybe no water at all coming through the faucet. It may take different formats, right? And so just think about that as well. If you think about APIs, think about them as the plumbing system of the internet or as the wait staff of the internet. But again, as organizations, are using APIs to communicate with one another, and to present information to you, and to basically collect information and converge them for you to enjoy in the front end. With all of this great power that APIs have, it also comes with great challenges, very great challenges. And APIs are a problem. I don't know how many of you saw Sound of Music, but it was one of my favorite movies growing up. And so I just really like to just use Maria, to just depict this as well, because how do we indeed solve problems of APIs? APIs have been seen as the top entry point for cloud compromises, according to media and the recent reports for the past 4 or 3 quarters thereabout. So APIs are contributing to 16.5% success rate on cloud compromises. So if you're paying a blind eye to APIs, this is not the time to continue to do this. In fact, nearly half of organizations globally, have, identifying and managing API sprawl as a major concern. Now, just to make sure I'm not throwing out, big words, that, we are not sure of the meaning. By sprawl, I mean, it's something that's out of control. You don't know where they are. You don't know what the versions they are. You don't have a full grip on what they're doing across the enterprise. And that's what I typically describe as an API sprawl. So this is sort of like a top concern, because a lot of enterprises are not maintaining an accurate inventory of their APIs. They do not know what all the APIs they have in their environment is, and so they are not able to manage that appropriately. So 48% of organizations are also saying that preventing this sort of sprawl that I spoke to you about is a top challenge. And 85% of organizations, sort of like have multi-cloud environments. So naturally, this means that if you're looking at this in terms of not knowing how the APIs that you have completely and being able to secure them and being able to govern them, just imagine that that's happening across multiple cloud environments as well. Now, to put this in perspective, 26 to 50 APIs power the average application. So it's not a small number we're looking at. So that means most enterprises have thousands of APIs in their arsenal, in their inventory to just protect and monitor. Now, again, to give some more perspective as to why this is a challenge, and trust me, we're not going to also talk about this only from the perspective of challenges. We're also going to talk about how we can come off this webinar being able to do better around managing APIs, right? So we also have the fact that organizations release 1 to 3 API updates per day. Now, this is huge, considering the fact that we have at least 50 APIs powering each application. If you have many of those applications and you're releasing updates per day, how then are we able to keep up with security testing? I want you to keep that somewhere in your mind, because you're going to come up to that. Because a lot of times, like Grant mentioned, the emphasis is on, is this able to meet our functional needs? So you find that organizations are spending way more time thoroughly testing functionality. But because of the pace and speed of deployment of APIs, they are not exactly doing the same effort in terms of security. So security takes a back seat. Security takes a back, pressing the back pedal. And so we're not seeing security being very, very prioritized. And this has very lasting impacts that I'm going to share very soon. So 900% increase in attacks is what we're seeing, and those attackers are really looking at shadow APIs, those APIs that we don't know much about or are not sure exist or are not knowledgeable about their existence. So Gartner, in a few years back, had actually forecasted that API attacks will be the most common attack vector in 2022. But now they're also saying in 2024, the year we are currently in, that API abuses and related data breaches will double. And we're seeing that beginning to be the thing. I mean, very recently we had Trello, a data breach that led to 15 million records being exposed. And that's the thing with API security related breaches. The bad guys don't hit it small. It's always big because of how important and how much of a connector APIs are. They're sort of like the glue of our digital ecosystem. So imagine that glue being tampered with. It generally always has very huge implications. There's also the thing to think about as well. The compliance and people generally, organizations in the regulator space are zooming in on APIs because of the high profile breaches and the increase in the number of high profile breaches. There's then become, a very strong need to not just think about securing the enterprise only from the ways that we have typically done that without calling out APIs in terms of the specific needs that APIs have as we go on in our digital transformation journeys across the world, and I dare say in Africa, where this is happening at an unprecedented speed. Now, if you're joining us from anywhere else other than the African continent, please let me know in the chat section. Just drop a message on the country. Just tell us what country you're joining us from outside of the African continent as well. So when I'm speaking, I can also talk and direct what I'm saying to you. So an example of how compliance and regulation is really coming into the API security space is, for example, the PCI DSS standard, which is basically the standard that really just guides anyone that's collecting payment card information. We see that in the 4.0 version of that standard, there is now very laid out requirements for APIs to meet, and all of the technical partners must support the organization to meet these API needs, or the API security needs, for us to be able to maintain compliance. So again, these directions shows very clearly that APIs are not one of those things to keep in the back burner anymore. We also see what's happening in Australia, for example, where, again, very recent data breaches have put a spotlight on API vulnerabilities, driving the Australian government, the Cyber Security Centre, to then add, a piece of what they expect in the latest edition of their ISM. So ISM being the information security manual. So you see, it's quite a big thing, API security issues here. And finally, the world is paying attention to it. But these are the major risks that we face if we do not pay attention to it. First, we're going to face data exposure issues like I spoke about earlier on, where, for example, Trello lost millions of records, which again, the bad guys are going to cash out on. And it's not small money. It's going to be millions of dollars. Excuse me. There's account takeover risk as well. There's a risk of fraudulent transactions which will cost the enterprise monies. There's also risk of hacktivism, and there's very huge risk of denial of service attacks. But what are these bad boys that we need to definitely zooming on? What are these bad things that we are currently doing that maybe we're not aware of, that we can definitely fix up and pay more attention to? The first key thing is we are equating authentication to authorization a lot of times. Now, those are two different things. And again, I'm just going to go back again to zoom in and not assume. So I like to describe authentication this way. I rock up here now, I say I'm confident Staveley. You're not sure I'm confident Staveley, and you want me to prove that I'm confident Staveley. So I have to do something, maybe say something or show my ID to prove that I am confident Staveley to Grant. And Grant can then confirm that I am confident Staveley, and then I continue to do what I need to do. But what am I allowed to do while Grant has said, yes, I confirm that this is confidence Staveley? What am I authorized to do? What do I have permissions to do? Are there things I'm not allowed to do? And again, I'll bring another analogy. Now, I come to your house, I knock on your door, you've given me your address, and I knock on your door and I'm let in. Am I supposed to just be courteous enough to just sit in the living room, or I can take the liberty to come upstairs to your room and just lie in your bed, drink some wine, have myself a good time in your master bedroom, and maybe take a bit of a leak? What am I allowed to do? But if for example, it's true, but I mean, if for example, I'm not defining that my guests can come, right? maybe when they come, I have 2 living rooms. I have a guest room and I have an upper chamber living room. They're not allowed in my upper chamber living room, but they're allowed in my guest guest living room downstairs, right? That is what you have said. While they are downstairs, they're not allowed to make coffee for themselves. My coffee machine is one very high is a vintage machine. For example, it was made by such a celebrity that makes them, such an expensive machine. So I need someone to be able to, who have trained, make the coffee for the guests. Those are all the permissions that you can then lay out. But what we are seeing in the enterprise is that we're just authenticating the user and then we're going to sleep. We are not, for example, saying what they must do and defining and enforcing authorization. So we are then seeing countless examples of API breaches where an attacker can leverage APIs to access records of like other users because by themselves they've been authenticated, and so they can then access records of way more users, and that is not what authorization done right is supposed to do. And that is also why that is the number one OWASP API security best practice, or the number one API security, OWASP API security risk that is documented, which is broken object level authorization. A lot of organizations are not doing this, and this is accounting for a lot of API related breaches. So many organizations are enforcing authentication on their APIs, and they just think that they're done. We need to make sure that that is not just where it ends, that our users are authenticated, and then they are also authorized. And very importantly, I want to also add that we are also ensuring that the unique identifiers of our users on our systems, that they are not incremental in such a way that we can easily guess what the next ID is going to be like. So if we're doing it in a flow where I am number 71, so the next user is going to be 72, and the next user is going to be 73, and so on. Attackers can guess that, and then they can always run through those numbers and cause a lot of havoc and also cause authentication flaws. So if you're trying to address application logic directly, then one of the key things to do is to be able to create unique identifiers that are not guessable. Now, that brings me to the next guy here, which is what I like to call the 3 musketeers. Now, I call them the 3 musketeers because these 3 guys here account for at least 90% of the breaches that we see. So they are the guys you need to listen very carefully and address in your API security strategy, because without addressing them, you run a risk of many of the issues I've discussed here earlier on. So API security breaches, really are most times caused by these 3 issues: broken authentication, broken authorization, and excess data exposure. I'm going to speak about, one of them more in the coming slides. But I mean, I've spoken about authorization before, where we're basically implementing users, and because of that, one user is authenticated and is able to access records of other users. And then for authentication, for example, broken authentication, we're looking at issues around poor passwords, password policies. We're looking at issues around, not having 2-factor authentication set up, and of course, an attacker brute forcing their way in. We're looking at issues like password stuffing attacks, being able to allow the bad guys access records of people that are not them. So that authentication is broken, and the lack of capture, for example, is another key thing that leaves the door open for attackers to really get in and get information out. But then with excess data exposure, it's really just true to its name, where, for example, we have vulnerabilities where APIs are returning unnecessary information, way more data than is necessary. And then we are relying on the user interface to act as a filter. I'm going to speak about that much later very soon. But again, these are some of the key issues that we get to see very often and we must address. But this is another 3rd issue I'm going to go on, and I have 8 of these common API security pitfalls that I want you to pay very close attention to. Now, the 3rd one is that we are still testing manually, we are still testing periodically, and we are not testing on every release. So these are the major issues that we face. Now, what is wrong with testing manually? This is what's wrong with testing manually. Now, if we say that we get API updates at least once every day, 1 or 3 API updates daily, is it feasible for the development teams to do their work and then leave it for the security teams to also, test before it goes to production? Aren't we just doing like a just-in-time thing that leaves so many chances for vulnerabilities to make it into production? So those are the risks we are taking when we are not automating testing, when we are not integrating security into the CI/CD pipeline. So these are the issues that we are seeing. So if we, for example, see security as that thing that we need to slap on at the end, for example, if security or testing of APIs is an afterthought where something like say, oh, let the security guys do it over the weekend, and maybe the security guys is their weekend, they also need to go partying. What happens to the vulnerabilities, in that time? So those are the issues we're seeing. And if, for example, we also fall in the bracket of people who say, you know what, we are going to do the test of all of our APIs twice every year. That ceremonial thing where we have to just tick off that box, we have tested everything. You do it twice a year and we feel good with ourselves. What happens is that we would have already sent in several vulnerable pieces of code, APIs with all of the vulnerabilities that the bad guys can find and exploit, and we would not even know it. And if we're doing it, we're not doing it on every release. That means, although we're spending time checking that the functionality of the APIs is exactly as planned, we are not making sure that security is also covered. So these are the issues. And so we must make sure that security challenges resulting from the faster development cycles of CI/CD are not impacting the security of our APIs, that security doesn't lack visibility and control in development process, that new builds are deployed in production with misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, and other security issues. Now, for example, developers in many cases are not skipping security processes. We also need to make sure that software is not released without going through security checks and testing. And the security team is keeping pace with the release cadences. So these are all of the key things. And the security team actually works closely with the development team. So these are some key pitfalls that you must pay attention to. And speaking about visibility again, visibility I find are in two areas or two core issues around visibility. First, that there is lack of centralization for inventory management or inventory of APIs. So we don't have a grip on all of the APIs that we have. And so this lack of visibility somehow has been created by the fact that we're not publishing in a standard way. We're not designing our APIs in a standard way. We believe that we do not believe that all APIs should get deployed without going through standardization or well-defined processes. We do not have the governance, for example, to ensure that we have these steps that must be followed in a very standard way, in a predictable way, to have the same outcomes, and they are not managed in a central position. So then we begin to hear things like shadow APIs, you hear rogue APIs, and all the sorts. So if we are not doing API management or API governance, like how you're going to get to hear me say very frequently, you're not doing that very well, then you're going to have poor visibility issues where you cannot inventory all of the APIs. And really, the second part of the visibility problem is, can you actually secure what you don't know? That's the thing. And when I mean no, it's not just in the existence of an API, but there may be versions of it. Are we aware of all of those versions, right? If we're not aware of them, we cannot secure what we do not know. And so making sure that we're able to deploy APIs and we're able to keep track of all of them is very key. Another key, or rather my fifth of eight API security pitfalls that are common is that, like I mentioned earlier on, because we have an API with our waiter go to the kitchen, and then aside the pizza we have ordered, one cheese pizza, for example, the API, instead of just getting the cheese pizza, then gets all of the pizza cooked and waiting for clients for just get all of the pizzas, and we load them up in our service tray, and we bring them. But just before we get to the to the client, or rather the customer that's sitting on the table. We then say, okay, let's leave the serving tray here, and then we'll only take just the one pizza that the client actually, or the customer said they wanted, and just present to them. But we've already gotten so close to the table, for example. So what if the customer gets their pizza that they actually ordered for and says, oh my God, I perceive some really nice other flavors there, and goes on to the serving tray and carries all of them? What is going to become of us? You know, that's exactly what's happening in our ecosystem, where we are exposing so much data, and we are then trusting only the user interface, which is the front end, to do the filtering. That is too much of a burden to put on our front end. The problem is attackers are, finding APIs that are powering that user interface, and they're hitting them directly and bypassing all of the controls that we have put in place. So if you're trusting your user interface to filter the information, it means the API, is returning more than you need. And so you should just be able to ensure that you have rules for the APIs to only, return what's required. So it shouldn't be that all of that is happening and the burden is on the UI. No, you have to make sure that that is handled in the logic and the whole flow that you have in place. Now, the fifth common pitfall that I see quite a lot is that we are trusting without verifying, right? I mean, it's easy for us to really think about this from the way it's implemented in terms of the front end. But when we're talking about APIs, let me paint a picture for you. So APIs do not just get their inputs from the end user, who is maybe somebody using an application. The user input could also come from another API. So let's say your partners are exposing their APIs to you, and you're consuming them to be able to provide a service to your own customers using your enterprise application, for example. That input from the other partner API is user input and must not be trusted. Any input whatsoever from anywhere must not be trusted. So all inputs must be inspected, must be sanitized, like we see here in terms of what's happening in a zero trust club that we've all come to have fun, right? You say you're providing this, then we need to check, is what you're providing what we're expecting? For example, and if what you're providing is what we're expecting, is it in the right quantity? Are you bombarding me too much, more than I was expecting? Are you even supposed to be giving me what you're giving me? You need to check all of that, because what's also happening is that one of the major ways API security breaches can lead to bigger issues is that the partner gets breached, and then from the partner being breached, another partner is being breached, because again, trust is something that is taken for granted. So we know that you want to trust, but we also need to verify all user inputs. I don't tend to make you hungry, but I really like to use this analogy of a very famous food chain. When I'm having a burger in Joburg or in Cape Town, and I'm having a burger at this restaurant in New York, or I'm having a burger at this restaurant in Los Angeles, or I'm having a burger from this particular place in somewhere in Australia, for example, the burgers stay consistent. The experience stays consistent with the burgers. And that's exactly how governance should be, in a way that allows for long-lasting impact to be made around solving API security issues. And I'm going to talk you through the key pillars, for example, that you need to put in place. But I'm saying that to say that there should be established processes that consistently govern how your API should go from development phase to the retirement phase. It should be predictable. There should be processes, and it should be uniform and consistent for every single API that is produced or that's consumed within your ecosystem. So here are the three pillars that I believe will play a major role if you want to really take API security very seriously. And I'm inspired. This particular framework was created by API Hughes, so just to give them some shout out there as well. So these three pillars are governance. So you need to govern your APIs, how they are developed, how they are run securely. You need to ensure that you have consistency in documentation, for example. All of that, the governance of that and the processes around that is something that you must maintain very, very consciously. You must also test and ensure that your APIs are free of vulnerabilities. And this is something that you must test on every release. Again, with automating and stacking these things up in terms of how you're protecting your APIs. It's not just one, but you're doing your defense, in depth properly. Then it won't just be one control you're employing in terms of testing. There'll be different types of testing that you will need to put in place at different times. But again, testing first and foremost will be automated and integrated into your CI/CD. The next key thing is you've deployed it into production, right? But that's not where it stops. You need to monitor what's happening. You need to know what's normal, for example, what's abnormal behavior. And in real time, you need to be able to catch when something is wrong, when maybe data is being exfiltrated through your APIs. You need to know when that's happening. That is only possible when you're monitoring and analyzing what's happening with your APIs in real time. My time is fast spent. I've already spoken for 30 plus minutes. So I'm going to really run through. Okay, I think I'm having a challenge with this slide, but it's not showing properly like I would have intended for it to show. But I'm just going to talk us through what those different layers are. The first layer in your burger here is secure practice and regulatory compliance. You want to make sure that whatever you're doing is guided by best practices and it complies with regulation, because again, we clearly see that if you're not complying to regulation, some people can get to go to jail, you can get fined, you can lose your license to do business, like we now see, for example. And so we must make sure that whatever we are doing is backed by security best practices and regulation as well. We must make sure that it's standardized, and that's the meat actually in our burger, right? Standardization, ensuring that it stays consistent and it's something that gets done the same way. We also need to ensure for our next layer in terms of the vegetables coming into your burger, that we must have effective API documentation. Another part of the vegetable layer is that we must ensure that the behaviors of our APIs are predictable. And then the last layer of the vegetable is that there should be seamless integration across the CI/CD pipeline. Now, the last part of your burger here, being the bottom part, is change management. And that's where a lot of organizations get it wrong. What happens when there are changes to, for example, or there are updates to your APIs? Is change management happening fluidly? Of course, many times that's where we drop the ball. So that brings me to my last best practice, or rather my last pitfall, which is that we're expecting people to behave in a certain way. We're expecting the dev team and the product owners to do the right thing in terms of APIs and actually prioritize security as much as they'll prioritize functionality. Are we giving them the training that they need? Are we ensuring that in our budgets that we have security training and this is done frequently enough to reflect the changes that are happening in the security landscape and changes that are going on in the threat landscape? Now, even PCI is asking for us to do these trainings. I think, is it every quarter or twice a year at the very minimum? So that means that your dev teams and everyone that touches the product in some way or form must be trained. And must be trained to have to know how security can be implemented in APIs. So like this comic shows, we are just looking to build some shiny new tools every now and again. We are saying, who's going to break in? Let's leave the door open. It doesn't matter, right? We are just looking for shortcuts to quickly, get things out of the way and move on. We are not exactly fixing the issues. And so we must make sure that the people who are doing this, other than the security team, because we most likely know what we're doing a lot of times, I'm hoping, excuse me, but we must make sure that other guys are also doing the right thing. I just wanted to also just leave us with something to walk home with. This is about maybe my last slide with information. So we need to do this across the life cycle, ensure that we're integrating security across the life cycle. And we're doing this in a way that we have different ways that we're addressing security issues. First, by the time we're defining APIs, we need to ensure that we have governance, functionality, and policies that are applied. And by the time development is happening, that we have our code reviews, scheduled to ensure that we're picking up issues with the code. We're having our static code analysis. We're having our composition analysis and all of that. We're also doing our testing in the testing phase. And the testing we are doing is not just functionality testing, but we are testing with our legacy dynamic application security testing tools. We are doing our periodic petition testing tools. So we're doing our periodic petition testing, as we go on. But again, legacy testing is happening on every release. We also have possibly bug bounty programs that also release. You see how these different testing are happening at different times, and so it gets to catch vulnerabilities also at different times. So excuse me. Now, you may not necessarily have a bug bounty program. Maybe you don't yet have a budget for it. But I always say, if you don't have a budget for bug bounty, do you have a very laid out responsible disclosure program for your organization? How can people who find vulnerabilities report them without being victimized, for example? If you don't have this, then I don't think you're taking testing seriously. So these are some of the key issues to also, because a lot of times we're always thinking about, oh, I don't have a budget for that tool or this tool, but are we leveraging, our ecosystem, our entire, other people to basically tell us what could possibly be wrong with our APIs? And in deployment, we definitely want to make sure that we have our web server and API gateways. And if you can afford, there are more tools there as well that you can put on. But then for monitoring, and again, another area that is a big issue, we are not pulling all of this information in terms of what's happening in real time into our SIEM tools. So if we are not consolidating all of what's happening to our SIEM tool for us to be able to really look at what's going on in real time and monitor it, and ensure that our SOC teams are also able to have visibility over what's happening via our APIs, then we're doing ourselves a disservice. So that is where this comes in terms of monitoring. It's not just the WAF tool, but also how that comes into your SIEM tool. But my last thing here as well in the integration across the life cycle is retirement. What happens to your APIs when they're deprecated? Are there governance things, like governance processes, that takes care of what happens to those APIs in a way that protects your enterprise? Because if, for example, I'm testing, and I've seen this in a couple of clients that we've worked with, I'm testing, and once I see 1.3, in my head, I know there's the 1.2. In my head, there may also be a 1.1. So I'm definitely looking at 1.1, and most times it's still available to me. So I exploit 1.1. And meanwhile, you've had that particular vulnerability fixed in 1.3, but the API is still available for me to be consumed. So I would exploit it, and that's exactly what the bad guys are going to do as well. Now, what's even more painful is that for that even deprecated API, we've not cut off access to, say, our backend, DB, and all of that. So that API that is with that vulnerability that is known is still accessible to the back end and can still access the back end for all sorts of things. So the versioning issue is not a vulnerability by itself, but it's a gateway to vulnerabilities and other issues that you may experience. So definitely, please take retirement very seriously. I spoke earlier on about my book, so you can definitely check it out. I won't be boring you anymore with that. But at this point, I would like to see if you have any questions, and I'm happy to take them in the time we have.
Thank you so much for that confidence. Yeah, I quite learned a lot from this. I like the fact that you took it from somebody with no background in API security could follow the conversation all the way to some of the more nuts and bolts of it. So quite insightful. Maybe just a question from my side before I allow the delegates to ask as well. API Sec University, do you recommend them? Are they quite good? Because I'm quite always conscious before I encourage people to look at them. What's your take on them?
I very much recommend them. A lot of their courses are free, but they're also very high quality as well. So, and why I recommend them a lot as well is that there is a knowledge gap in terms of API and securing APIs, generally speaking, right? And so I find that they're meeting quite a very major need. Aside books that I definitely recommend, there are a couple of very good books. I would definitely say look at API Sec University and take one of their courses or as many of their courses as can take, and you'll be better off for it.
No, perfect. Thank you so much. I see in terms of questions, Roberto.
Yes, thank you very much. Firstly, thank you so much for your time and for this insightful webinar. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Roberto.
I learned a lot, and I know I'm very guilty of this, having worked at cybersecurity vendors for years, be it SIM, be it endpoint. We always said, oh, that use case, I don't worry, you can do that with the API. So we'd POC something, we'd give it full permissions, we'd just say, you see, it works. So it's cool. And then that always gets rolled out in production. And I think certainly what's made me think a lot about this is, what is your API return? You know, the analogy of the bring every pizza and which one did you actually order? You know, the data sitting right there, but also features that are deprecated or not documented within an API. And I think it's unfair to place the risk on the customer that got breached because the software that they're using had undocumented features or bugs or whatever you want to call them in their API, etc. So it's such a tricky one in terms of where the fault lies and who takes that risk on. But yeah, really, really appreciated it and lots to think about. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Roberto. I just want to add there as well that even with regulations and oversights, I've noticed, for example, that the what are they called? I'm trying to remember. Not just the White House, but there's a security agency, cybersecurity agency in America. I'm trying to remember their names. There was a recent white paper that was released by them, and they are basically saying that users should not be placed with the responsibilities of taking care of vulnerabilities or protecting themselves, in a way that the software vendor should have. So now we are clearly seeing that we're not going to be able to push as much as we used to be able to the user and say, this is what you should have done. But then we need to build software tools. We need to build web applications that are secure by default. They're secure by default and they're secure by design. So these are all things that being able to think about them in the way that we should think about them fully as our responsibility then empowers our customers to be able to use these tools in a more secure way. And I want to also believe that within the next 5 years, we are going to see a considerable shift in terms of how much blame can be placed on the end users as compared to the producers of software and application tools that we consume. So while we can be ahead of the curve and just do the right things and not be forced by regulation to do the right things, I believe that we can begin to train ourselves for that time.
Thank you so much for that confidence and also for the question, Roberto. Anybody else has got a question, a comment, any thoughts on this topic? We still have a few minutes with confidence.
I have a thought. I just wanted to say thank you so much, CS, for highlighting some of the themes that are very common, especially on the conversation of sanitizing data from end users. This is something that has come up even in SQL injection as well. But the way you explained it in terms of the analogy and just bring it forward in terms of storytelling, I think it gave a really nice, clearer perspective. So I really appreciated that.
Thank you so much, Kachipa.
Thank you so much. Anybody else? Thoughts, questions, comments? Okay. Doesn't look like it confidence. So I think on this note, I will say thank you so much to you. I genuinely appreciate your time, taking the time out to speak to us, sharing some insights on this topic. Again, I emphasize it's an often overlooked topic. And I actually find that there's a few of these things, we seem to be speaking to the topics that are, I want to say, it's commercially viable topics, where the big vendors are keen to sponsor. But, we had a webinar 2 weeks ago on SAP security. It's also not something that's discussed often, yet most organizations are running SAP, as the core of what they do. So one of the things we want to do as a chapter is continuously shining the light on these overlooked topics, log management, asset management, the things that we don't really pay attention to, but it underpins everything we do. So really thank you for your time on this. And thank you as well for the people taking time out. I know it's a start of the Easter holidays, so thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Grant, for having me, and thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity.
Thank you. Have a great evening, all, and we will post a recording on our YouTube channel in a week or so. And keep well and stay blessed.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Thanks, Grant. Appreciate it.